Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I'm going to start by saying that I'm sorry. This isn't one of those tales where I'm passing some nightmare from my mind into yours for cheap thrills. This is something that needs to be documented. Something that people should know about. I'm Palestinian, born and raised in Ramallah. We have our own version of the dogmen that Americans whisper about around campfires. We call it the Gulf Alpha. Growing up, I dismissed it as folklore. A story passed down through generations to frighten children into staying indoors after dark. According to the stories, one of the high-ranking members in Hamas, who was also part of a secretive organization called the Directorate of Paranormal Defense, supposedly struck a deal with non-human intelligent creatures. These beings were covered in fur and could speak Pasinda, an ancient dialect that few Palestinians still understand. To me, this always sounded like propaganda designed to instill hope. A narrative suggesting we had powerful allies beyond human understanding. It seemed like psychological warfare, a way to make our enemies believe we had supernatural support. I never believed any of it. Not until May of 2023, when I traveled to America and experienced something that shattered my understanding of reality. My cousin Fareed and I arrived in Michigan to film his documentary about diaspora experiences. He'd been living in America for 15 years, working as an independent filmmaker. I came to help with production and to experience America firsthand. We rented a cabin at Higgins Lake, surrounded by nearly 500 kilometers of dense forest, with numerous caves scattered throughout the wilderness. The cabin was isolated, positioned on the northeastern shore where few tourists ventured. It was perfect for filming, remote, atmospheric, and untouched by modern development. During our first 3 weeks, everything progressed smoothly. We filmed during daylight and sometimes captured night scenes when the script required it. I should have recognized the signs in Fareed's behavior, the way he insisted on certain filming locations, how he seemed to study the forest with anticipation rather than artistic consideration. But I was too busy learning about camera work and adjusting to the unsettling silence of American wilderness. So different from the constant background noise of Ramallah. It began on the third day of our fourth week. We were packing equipment after filming a particularly challenging scene near a rock formation about half a kilometer from the cabin. The sun had already set, leaving us in that peculiar twilight where shadows grow long and the mind begins to play tricks. As I disconnected the boom microphone, I heard it. Scratching sounds followed by low, guttural growls coming from the dense tree line about 30 meters away. The sounds weren't like anything I'd heard before, not quite wolf, not quite bear, but something that seemed to contain elements of both. I froze, my body tensing as primal fear surged through me. "Fareed," I whispered, "do you hear that?" When I turned to look at him, what I saw confused me more than the sounds. Fareed appeared calm, almost peaceful. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly, as if he'd just heard the voice of an old friend calling his name. His reaction was so incongruous with the menacing sounds that I questioned my own hearing. "It's just the wind moving through the trees," he said dismissively. "Or maybe a raccoon. Come on, let's finish packing." But I knew what I heard wasn't wind or a small forest animal. The growls had intelligence behind them, a deliberate quality that made the hairs on my arms stand up. This continued for 6 consecutive nights. Always between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. Always when we were alone, and always with Fareed displaying that unsettling calmness in response. I began to have trouble sleeping. When darkness fell, I would lie awake, my ears straining to catch those sounds again. Sometimes they would come from different directions, as if whatever made them was circling our cabin, studying us. Other times there would be silence so absolute it felt manufactured, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. On the seventh night, I confronted Farid. There's something out there, something that's following us. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Perhaps there is, he said quietly, but not everything unknown is dangerous. His cryptic response only intensified my unease. On the morning of the 8th day after the first incident, I discovered something that turned my fear into terror. Large scratch marks ran down the eastern side of the cabin, deep gouges in the wood that could not have been made by any common forest animal. They started about 7 feet high and ran almost to the ground, as if something very tall had dragged massive claws downward with considerable force. When Farid saw them, his reaction stunned me. His eyes welled up, but not with fear. They appeared to be tears of joy or relief. He quickly composed himself when he noticed my stare. "Probably just a bear," he said, his voice betraying an emotion I couldn't identify. "We should report it to the ranger station." But we never did report it. Farid always found excuses to delay the call, and eventually, the subject was dropped entirely. I began to document everything. I took photos of the scratch marks with my phone and started keeping a journal of the sounds and their timing. I noted Farid's strange reactions, his seemingly choreographed movements through the forest when we filmed, almost as if he was performing for an audience we couldn't see. On the 14th day, while filming near a small clearing, I noticed clumps of fur caught in a thornback strawberry bush. The fur was thick and coarse, dark brown with hints of gray, too large to belong to any normal woodland creature in the area. When I pointed it out to Farid, he muttered something under his breath that sounded like kumatulo. The word meant nothing to me, but he spoke it with reverence. I collected some of the fur in a plastic bag when Farid wasn't looking. That night, alone in my room, I examined it under the small microscope we had brought for documenting interesting natural elements for the film. What I saw made no scientific sense. The hair structure didn't match any North American mammal I could identify through online research. My mind began constructing explanations. An escaped exotic animal, perhaps, or some undocumented species. But deep down, I knew these rationalizations were just attempts to avoid confronting a more terrifying possibility. 3 days later, on day 17 of our ordeal, I saw it. I had woken before dawn, restless from another night of intermittent sleep punctuated by distant howls. I made coffee and stepped onto the back porch to watch the sunrise over the lake. The morning mist hung low over the water, creating an otherworldly landscape of gray and silver. Movement at the tree line caught my eye, something large and dark, partially obscured by fog and distance. At first, I thought it was a wolf. But as I squinted through the morning haze, my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The creature stood upright on 2 legs. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with a distinctly canine head atop a muscular, fur-covered body that seemed to blend elements of human and wolf anatomy. Its proportions were wrong in ways that made my stomach lurch. Arms too long, shoulders too broad, legs bent at angles that suggested both human and quadrupedal design. For several seconds, it remained motionless, staring directly at me across the clearing. Then it dropped to all fours and vanished into the trees with impossible speed. My coffee mug shattered on the deck. I hadn't even realized I'd dropped it. I stumbled back inside, heart hammering against my ribs. Farid emerged from his room, alerted by the noise. "What happened? Are you hurt?" he asked, but his eyes held knowledge, not concern. "I saw something," I stammered. "Behind the cabin, a wolf, but it stood up, on 2 legs, like a man." Instead of dismissing my claim or expressing shock, Farid calmly guided me to the couch and sat beside me. Tell me exactly what you saw, he said quietly. I described the creature in detail, my voice shaking. When I finished, Farid didn't speak for several minutes. Then he sighed deeply, as if coming to a decision. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, he began. But after what you've seen, perhaps you'll be more willing to listen than you were as a child. Farid told me the same story I'd heard throughout my childhood, about Palestine making a pact with beings called the Gulf Alpha. But this time, sitting in that cabin thousands of miles from home with the memory of what I'd just witnessed burning in my mind, I couldn't dismiss it so easily. The Directorate of Paranormal Defense wasn't propaganda, Farid explained. It was real, a secret division established during the 1960s after several encounters with non-human entities in the caves near Jericho. According to Farid, the Gulf Alpha were an ancient species that had existed alongside humans for millennia, remaining hidden by choice. They possessed intelligence equal to or greater than humans, and had developed their own language and culture. They weren't supernatural beings, but biological entities that had evolved along a different path. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, we were desperate. A high-ranking official named Ibrahim Nassar encountered a group of Gulf Alpha while hiding in a cave system. Instead of fleeing or fighting, he attempted communication. Over time, they developed a rudimentary means of understanding each other. Eventually, a pact was formed. The agreement was simple but profound. The Gulf Alpha would provide intelligence and occasional intervention in exchange for protection of their remaining territories and recognition of their sovereignty as a non-human nation. But why would they help us? I asked, still struggling to accept this revelation. Because they were also being displaced, Farid said solemnly. Their territories were shrinking worldwide as human development expanded. They saw in our struggle a reflection of their own. Farid explained that the Gulf Alpha had clans across the globe, including North America. The Michigan clan was particularly strong, having adapted to the dense forests and cave systems of the Upper Peninsula. This documentary was never just about diaspora, Farid admitted. I was sent to establish contact with the Michigan clan, to renew old alliances. I stared at him, feeling betrayed and frightened. You used me. I brought you because you're family, he countered. And because it's time you understood the truth about our history, about what we're fighting to protect. I wanted to believe it was all an elaborate hoax or that Farid had lost his mind. But I had seen the creature with my own eyes. The scratch marks, the fur, the sounds in the night. All of it suddenly formed a terrifying pattern of truth. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because they're coming tonight, Farid said. And they want to meet you. The day passed in a blur. Farid attempted to teach me basic phrases in Pasinda, explaining that it was a language developed specifically for communication between humans and Gulf Alpha, accommodating both species' vocal capabilities. As darkness fell, my anxiety grew until I could barely breathe. Part of me wanted to flee, to run from the cabin and never look back, but a deeper part needed to know the truth, to confirm with my own eyes what Farid had told me. At midnight, Farid called me outside to watch the stars, as we don't get much opportunity for stargazing in the light-polluted skies of Ramallah. The night was clear and cold, the Milky Way stretching across the sky in a brilliant band of light. We sat in silence for nearly an hour before I heard rustling from the direction of the forest. My muscles tensed, ready to run, but Farid placed a restraining hand on my arm. Don't move suddenly, he whispered. They interpret rapid movement as aggression. From the darkness emerged a figure that seemed to absorb the surrounding night. It was the creature I had seen that morning, but now I could see it clearly. Standing fully upright, it was nearly 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur with silver-gray streaks along its shoulders and back. Its face was a disturbing blend of wolf and human features, expressive eyes set in a long muzzle, ears that swiveled independently to track sounds. Behind it came two smaller figures, similar in appearance but not as imposing. They remained at the edge of the clearing, watching cautiously. I was paralyzed with terror, but Farid stood calmly and spoke words I recognized from our earlier lesson. Gumadulo, he said, a greeting that roughly translated to, under peaceful skies. The largest creature tilted its head, then responded in a voice that was deep and rumbling yet clearly articulated. Visan tu malak, camarade. That is Pacinda for, it's been so long, friend. Farid approached the creature without hesitation. I wanted to scream for him to stop, certain I was about to witness his death. But the creature made no aggressive moves. Instead, it lowered its head slightly in what appeared to be a gesture of respect. They conversed in Pacinda for several minutes while I remained frozen in place. Then Farid turned to me and beckoned. They want to meet you, he said. Don't run. They'll perceive it as a threat. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to stand. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I managed to take several stiff steps forward until I stood beside Farid, trembling visibly. Ha, piede camarade, Farid said, which he had taught me meant, hello, comrade. He nudged me gently. With a dry mouth and racing heart, I repeated the phrase, mangling the pronunciation in my terror. The creature made a sound that might have been laughter, a huffing, chuffing noise that sent shivers through my body. Then it spoke directly to me in Pacinda, words I couldn't understand. Its breath smelled of pine and something metallic. Farid translated. He says you have the scent of the old lands. You remind him of those who first made the pact. The creature reached out a massive hand, more paw than human appendage with retractable claws that could easily tear flesh, and held it palm up before me. Farid nodded encouragingly. With the greatest effort of will I've ever mustered, I slowly placed my hand atop its palm. The fur was coarse but warm. I could feel tremendous strength beneath it, muscles that could tear me apart without effort. We remained like that for perhaps 10 seconds before the creature withdrew its hand and stepped back. It spoke again to Farid, who bent down to address the two smaller Gulfalfa that had remained at a distance. I couldn't hear what was said, but when Farid straightened, he spoke the words, Paz fakal hirda. May we meet again under favorable circumstances. The creatures melted back into the forest with barely a sound, leaving me shaking in the clearing, struggling to process what had just occurred. They've been here longer than us, Farid explained as we sat in the cabin afterward, a bottle of whiskey between us. I had downed 3 shots in quick succession, trying to steady my nerves. The Gulfalfa have inhabited this continent for thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived. According to Farid, the Michigan clan had been particularly affected by human expansion. Logging, mining, and development had destroyed much of their territory. They had been forced to adapt, to become more nocturnal, to hide in the most remote areas. The one you met is called Varkan. He's the leader of this clan, Farid said. The smaller ones were his offspring. Why did you really bring me here? I asked, still feeling betrayed despite the wonder of what I'd experienced. Farid's expression grew serious. Because our connection with the Gulfalfa is dying. The old ones who established the pact are gone. The new generation doesn't believe, doesn't understand the importance of maintaining these alliances. He poured another shot. I was tasked with documenting the Michigan clan, confirming their continued existence, and renewing our pledge of mutual aid. But I was also supposed to identify potential new ambassadors who could carry on this work. The implication hung in the air between us. You want me to become involved in this, I stated, not a question. You've seen them now, you know they're real. Can you go back to your life pretending they don't exist? Farid challenged. I thought about it for a long time before answering. What exactly is the nature of this mutual aid? What do we provide them, and what do they do for us? Farid hesitated. It's complicated. We help protect their territories from development through various means, sometimes legal, sometimes not. We provide information about human activities that might threaten them. In return, they share knowledge, act as sentinels in remote areas, and occasionally intervene in situations where human methods have failed. Intervene how? I pressed. There's a reason certain military operations have failed inexplicably in our territories, Farid said quietly. Why some soldiers return with stories of monsters they encountered in the darkness. The implications of what he was saying made my stomach turn. These creatures were being used as weapons, or were using us to further their own agenda. The stories in America, I said slowly. The Dogman sightings, the attacks. Not all clans honor the original agreements, Farid admitted. Some have gone rogue, become hostile to all humans. Others protect their territory more aggressively than we would prefer. I thought of the countless reports of encounters with dogman-like creatures across America. The fear, the trauma, sometimes the violence. We're responsible for this, I whispered. No, Farid said firmly. They existed long before our pact, but our alliance may have emboldened some clans, given them ideas about interacting with humans that have had unintended consequences. That night marked the end of my old life, the life where the world made sense, where monsters existed only in stories and films. Everything changed once I accepted the reality of the Gulf Alpha. We stayed at Higgins Lake for another 2 weeks. During that time, I met with Varkan and his clan 3 more times. Farid taught me more Pacinda, enough to communicate basic concepts. I learned about their history, their culture, their struggle to survive in a world increasingly dominated by humans. They were intelligent and complex beings, capable of sophisticated thought and emotion. They had their own art forms, their own belief systems, their own understanding of the world that was both alien and familiar. But I also learned darker truths. The Michigan clan was one of the more peaceful groups, but others had become increasingly hostile toward humans as their territories were destroyed. Some had taken to hunting humans who ventured into what they considered their domain. The day before we left, Varkan brought me a gift, a small carved stone pendant in the shape of a wolf's head. When I accepted it, he spoke words that Farid translated. You now walk between worlds. This burden brings both power and danger. As we drove away from Higgins Lake, I asked Farid the question that had been haunting me. What happens now? That depends on you, he replied. You can try to forget what you've seen, return to your old life. Many have tried. Few succeed. And the alternative? You become part of the network. You help maintain the balance, ensure the pact is honored on both sides. I fingered the stone pendant around my neck. These attacks in America, can they be stopped? Perhaps, Farid said. With better communication, with renewed understanding on both sides. The hostility comes from fear and loss. If we can address those underlying causes. I thought about the implications of what I now knew, about the responsibility that came with this knowledge. I need time, I said finally. Farid nodded. Take it, but not too much. The world is changing quickly, and the Gulf Alpha are running out of places to hide. Decisions will be made with or without your input. Now, months later, I sit writing this account, still uncertain of my path forward. I understand why I began with an apology. Knowledge is a burden, especially knowledge that reshapes your understanding of reality. If you've heard stories of dogman encounters, of unexplained creatures that seem neither fully animal nor human, know that there may be more truth to them than you've allowed yourself to believe. And know that somewhere, decisions are being made about these beings that could affect us all. I don't know if exposing this truth is the right thing to do, but I do know that ignorance is no longer an option for me. And perhaps it shouldn't be for you, either. The stone pendant sits beside me as I write these words. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I swear I can hear it whisper in a language I'm still learning to understand. A language that might help bridge the gap between two species that have shared this world for millennia, yet remain strangers to one another. A language that might prevent more violence, more fear, or that might finally bring everything crashing down around us all. God help us if I choose wrong. I've been telling this story for 15 years now, and each time I do, I notice how people's faces change when I get to the part about the eyes. That shift from casual interest to something deeper, something primal that recognizes truth when it hears it. This happened in September 2008, when I was 26 years old, living in a small cabin community outside Jamestown, Colorado, with my two closest friends, Vincent and Diego. The old Barquet ranch isn't what most people picture when they hear ranch. Forget the pastoral meadows and grazing cattle. This place spans over 4,000 acres of the most unforgiving mountain terrain in northern Colorado. Granite spires jut from the earth like broken teeth, and James Creek cuts a savage path through canyon walls that seem to press closer together with each passing season. The locals have stories about this place that stretch back to the earliest mining days, stories that make grown men avoid certain sections of the property after dark. Vincent had been living up there for 3 months, house-sitting for a guy who'd inherited the main cabin from his uncle. The cabin sat perched on a ridge about 7 miles west of Jamestown, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that became impassable once the snow started. Vincent loved the isolation, claimed it helped him write better music. Diego and I would make the drive up there most weekends, bringing supplies and staying until Sunday evening when the weight of Monday morning jobs would drag us back to civilization. The wildlife in that area is unlike anything I've encountered elsewhere in Colorado. During our weekend visits, we'd routinely see fresh tracks from mountain lions, bears, and wolves. The forest ranger we'd met at the Mercantile Cafe had warned us about the mountain lion population specifically. "They're different up there," he'd said, nursing a beer and speaking in the low, careful tone of someone who'd seen things that defied easy explanation. "Bigger, more aggressive, and they've started hunting in groups." That should have been warning enough, but when you're young and feel invincible, you tend to dismiss the concerns of older, more experienced people. We'd had our share of encounters with wildlife during our time at the ranch, but nothing that had genuinely frightened us. A few times we'd heard the distinctive scream of a mountain lion echoing through the canyon at night, but the sound always seemed to come from a safe distance. On that particular weekend in September, Diego and I had driven up Saturday morning, expecting to find Vincent working on a new song. Instead, we found a note taped to the cabin door. "Gone to Boulder for supplies. Back Sunday evening. Make yourselves at home. V." We should have turned around and driven back to town. That's what sensible people would have done. Instead, we decided to stay the night and surprise Vincent when he returned. The cabin was comfortable enough, with a wood-burning stove and a well-stocked pantry. We spent Saturday afternoon hiking the immediate area around the cabin, exploring trails we'd walked dozens of times before. But something felt different that day. The usual sounds of the forest, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant rustle of small animals moving through underbrush, were notably absent. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, like the moment before a thunderstorm when every living thing seeks shelter. Diego noticed it too. He kept stopping during our hike, tilting his head as if listening for something that wasn't there. "You feel that?" he asked around 3 in the afternoon as we stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the main canyon. I knew exactly what he meant. The feeling of being watched. Not by curious wildlife or other hikers, but by something that was studying us with an intelligence that felt entirely too focused, too purposeful. The sensation was so strong it made my skin crawl. We returned to the cabin as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks. Neither of us spoke about the unease we'd felt during the hike, but it lingered in the space between our conversations. We cooked dinner, played cards, and drank the beer we'd brought up from town, but underneath the normal rhythms of an evening with friends, tension coiled like a spring wound, too tight. Around 10 o'clock, Diego suggested we hike back down to town. Vincent's not coming back tonight anyway, he reasoned. We could surprise him tomorrow instead. I was about to agree when we heard Vincent's truck rumbling up the access road. Headlights swept across the cabin windows as he pulled into the clearing. We watched him unload groceries and gear, moving with the efficient motions of someone who'd made this trip many times before. "Surprise!" Diego called out as we emerged from the cabin. Vincent nearly dropped the box he was carrying. "God, you two scared me half to death. I thought someone had broken in." We helped him carry his supplies inside, and within minutes, the evening had transformed into the kind of spontaneous gathering that makes for the best memories. Vincent had brought back a bottle of whiskey from Boulder, and we spent the next 2 hours catching up on each other's lives, sharing stories and laughing in the way that only happens when good friends reunite. It was Diego who suggested the night hike. Vincent had been telling us about a new trail he'd discovered that led to a series of natural rock formations deeper in the canyon. "They look like ancient temples," he said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "You have to see them in the moonlight." By the time we left the cabin, it was nearly 1 in the morning. The September night was clear and cold, with a 3/4 moon providing enough light to navigate without flashlights. We should have brought them anyway. That decision, to rely on moonlight alone, would prove to be one of many small choices that led us into a situation none of us were prepared for. The trail Vincent had found was barely visible, more of a game path than anything humans had created. It wound through dense stands of pine and aspen, occasionally opening into small meadows where the moonlight pooled like spilled mercury. The silence that had troubled Diego and me earlier in the day seemed even more pronounced now. Our footsteps on the rocky trail sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. After about 40 minutes of steady hiking, we reached the rock formations Vincent had described. He hadn't been exaggerating. Towering columns of granite rose from the canyon floor, arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. In the moonlight, they did indeed resemble ancient ruins, the kind of place where you could imagine rituals being performed by people who understood secrets that modern civilization had forgotten. "This is incredible," I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to lower my voice. Vincent led us between the formations, pointing out details that were lost in shadow but clearly visible to him after multiple visits. There was a narrow passage between 2 of the largest columns that opened into a small amphitheater surrounded by stone walls. The acoustics in that space were remarkable. Every sound seemed amplified and clarified. It was in that amphitheater that we first heard it. The sound began as a low rumble, so deep it was felt more than heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the rock beneath our feet and resonating in our chests. For a moment we stood frozen, each of us trying to identify what we were hearing. "Rock slide?" Diego suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. The rumble continued for perhaps 30 seconds before fading into silence. In the quiet that followed, I became aware of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Something about that sound had triggered every evolutionary alarm bell built into human DNA. Vincent was the first to spot them. We were making our way back through the rock formations, moving more quickly now, motivated by a shared sense that we needed to be somewhere else. He stopped so suddenly that Diego nearly walked into him. "Do you see that?" Vincent's voice was barely a whisper. I followed his gaze to a point about 50 yards down the slope from where we stood. At first I saw nothing but shadows and the vague shapes of trees and boulders. Then the shadows shifted, and I saw them too. 2 points of yellow light, positioned at what would be eye level for something very tall. The lights didn't flicker or waver like reflections would. They held steady, fixed on our location with an intensity that made my stomach clench. Worse, they seemed to be studying us, evaluating us in a way that suggested intelligence and intent. "Mountain lion?" Diego asked, but his voice carried no more conviction than when he'd suggested the rock slide. I'd seen mountain lion eyes reflect light before. These weren't reflections. These were sources of illumination, glowing with their own cold fire. And they were positioned at least 8 feet off the ground. We stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. The lights never moved, never blinked. They simply watched us with a patience that felt predatory and calculating. Then, without warning, they disappeared. Not gradually, not by turning away or moving behind cover. They simply vanished, as if someone had switched off a light. "We need to go," Vincent said. "Now." We didn't argue. We began moving back toward the trail, trying to maintain some semblance of casual walking while fighting the urge to run. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant hoot of an owl, made us flinch. We'd covered maybe 100 yards when we heard the sound again. The same low rumble, but closer now, and followed by something that made my blood feel cold in my veins. The unmistakable sound of large branches snapping under enormous weight. The snapping sounds came from our left, moving parallel to our path through the forest. Whatever was making them was keeping pace with us, staying just out of sight in the dense undergrowth. The sounds were rhythmic, suggesting deliberate movement rather than random breakage. Something large was moving through the forest, and it was following us. Vincent increased his pace, and Diego and I matched him without discussion. The trail that had seemed charming and adventurous an hour earlier now felt like a gauntlet. Every turn could hide an ambush. Every shadow could conceal a predator. The snapping sounds continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always present. Occasionally, we'd hear what sounded like heavy breathing or snuffling, as if something was scenting the air, tracking us by smell as well as sight. "There," Diego said suddenly, pointing to our right. Another pair of yellow lights positioned on the opposite side of the trail from the first sounds. These were closer, maybe 30 yards away, and they moved as we watched. They seemed to be circling us, maintaining a consistent distance while changing position. The realization hit all 3 of us simultaneously. We were surrounded. Vincent stopped walking and began gathering dry wood from the forest floor. "Fire," he said simply. "We need fire." Diego and I immediately understood. We spread out, staying within sight of each other while collecting anything that would burn. Dead branches, pine needles, strips of bark, anything that might sustain a flame. The sounds of movement in the forest continued around us, but now they seemed more cautious, as if our pursuers were reassessing the situation. Working together, we built a rough fire pit using stones from the trail. Vincent had a lighter, and within minutes we had a small flame growing among the tinder we'd gathered. The fire cast dancing shadows around us, creating a perimeter of light that felt like safety, even though we knew it was largely illusory. As the flames grew, we added larger pieces of wood. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. For the first time since we'd spotted the lights, I felt like I could breathe properly. That's when the screaming started. I've heard a lot of animal sounds in my life. I've heard the scream of mountain lions, the howl of wolves, the roar of bears. The sound that erupted from the darkness around us was unlike any of those. It was a vocalization that seemed designed to inspire terror, a sound that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the most primitive parts of the brain. The scream began as a low roar, but quickly escalated into something that was part howl, part shriek, and part something I couldn't identify. It was impossibly loud, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. The sound physically hurt, making my ears ring and my chest vibrate with sympathetic resonance. Diego grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in with desperate strength. Vincent was frantically feeding more wood to the fire, sending sheets of flame and sparks into the night. The screaming continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, finally trailing off into a series of huffing sounds that reminded me uncomfortably of laughter. In the relative quiet that followed, we could hear our own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of our hearts. The fire provided light for maybe 20 feet in any direction. Beyond that perimeter lay absolute darkness, and we knew we were not alone in it. "What do we do?" Diego asked. His voice was steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Vincent was already gathering more fuel for the fire. "We keep the fire going until dawn," he said. "Then we get out of here." For the next several hours, we maintained a constant vigil. We fed the fire steadily, keeping the flames high and bright. We took turns sleeping, though none of us managed more than brief periods of unconsciousness. The sounds in the forest continued throughout the night. Not constant, but frequent enough to prevent any real rest. Sometimes we'd hear the heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. Sometimes we'd catch glimpses of those yellow lights at the edge of our firelight. Once, around 4 in the morning, we heard what sounded like voices having a conversation, just beyond our ability to make out words. The tones were definitely communicative, back and forth, as if 2 or more entities were discussing us. The first hints of dawn came as a gradual lightening of the eastern sky, barely visible through the canopy of trees above us. We'd burned through most of our fuel, and the fire had settled into a steady glow of coals. The sounds in the forest had stopped about an hour earlier, but none of us trusted the silence. As the light strengthened, we began to see the forest around us more clearly. What we saw made my stomach drop. The ground around our fire was marked with tracks. Not ordinary animal tracks, but impressions in the soft earth that defied easy explanation. They were large, much larger than any mountain lion or bear track I'd ever seen, and they were everywhere. The tracks formed rough circles around our camp, overlapping and intersecting in patterns that suggested our watchers had been moving constantly throughout the night. Some of the impressions were so deep, they suggested enormous weight. Others showed what looked like claw marks, gouged into the earth and the bark of nearby trees. "We need to document this," Vincent said, pulling out his phone to take pictures. But when he activated the camera, the screen showed nothing but static. Diego tried his phone with the same result. My phone was completely dead despite having been fully charged when we left the cabin. The electronic failure felt like the final straw. Whatever we'd encountered, it seemed to have properties that extended beyond the merely physical. We extinguished the fire carefully, making sure no embers remained that could start a forest fire, and began making our way back toward the cabin. The hike back was a nightmare of paranoia and exhaustion. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow could hide a threat. We moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, but the trails that had seemed familiar the night before now felt alien and threatening. About halfway back to the cabin, we found something that made us stop cold. Across the trail, at roughly head height, a massive pine tree had been stripped of its bark. The exposed wood was white and fresh, clearly done recently. But what made us stare in horror were the claw marks. Deep gouges ran from the base of the stripped section to well above our heads, higher than any bear could reach, even standing on its hind legs. We made it back to the cabin as the sun fully cleared the eastern peaks. In the clear light of morning, with Vincent's truck sitting in the driveway, and the familiar comfort of human habitation around us, the events of the night began to feel like a shared nightmare. But the physical evidence was undeniable. Our clothes were torn from pushing through underbrush. We were exhausted from a sleepless night, and we all carried the memory of those yellow lights, watching us with inhuman intelligence. Vincent made coffee while Diego and I sat on the cabin's front porch, staring out at the forest that had nearly claimed us. None of us spoke about what we'd experienced. The silence felt protective, as if talking about it might somehow summon it back. After an hour, we packed up and prepared to leave. Vincent was coming back to town with us. The isolation that had once appealed to him now felt dangerous. As we loaded the truck, I noticed he kept glancing back at the tree line, as if expecting to see those lights even in broad daylight. The drive back to Jamestown passed in relative quiet. It wasn't until we were sitting in the Mercantile Cafe, surrounded by the comfortable sounds of normal human activity, that we began to process what had happened. "We need to report this," Diego said finally. "Report what?" Vincent asked. "That we saw some lights in the forest? That we heard some sounds we couldn't identify?" He was right, of course. What could we tell authorities? That we'd been stalked by something that might or might not have been a known animal? That our phones had mysteriously failed? That we'd found tracks that didn't match anything in the guidebooks? Over the following weeks, we did research. We found stories from other people who'd had similar experiences in the Colorado mountains. Tales of glowing eyes, electronic failures, and encounters with something that didn't fit into any known category of wildlife. The internet was full of speculation and theories, but no definitive answers. The forest ranger we'd met before was more helpful when we described our experience in general terms. He listened carefully, nodding at details that seemed familiar to him. "You're not the first people to report something like this from that area," he said finally. "There's something up there. I don't know what it is, but I've seen enough evidence to know it's real." He pulled out a topographical map and marked several locations with a red pen. "These are areas where we've had multiple reports of unusual activity. Missing persons cases that don't add up. Equipment failures. Sightings of things that don't match any known wildlife." The pattern he showed us was sobering. The incidents weren't random. They clustered around specific geographical features, particularly areas with dense forest, steep terrain, and limited human access. "My advice?" the ranger continued. "Stay out of those areas, especially at night. And if you do go, never go alone. Always carry multiple light sources, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is." In the years since that night, I've followed his advice. I still love the Colorado mountains, but I've developed a healthy respect for the spaces between the trails, the places where the map says, "Here be dragons," in invisible ink. Vincent sold his interest in the Barquet cabin and moved back to Boulder. Diego eventually relocated to Arizona, claiming he needed more desert and less forest in his life. We stay in touch, and occasionally the conversation turns to that night in September. Each time, we remember new details, small things that seemed insignificant at the time but take on greater meaning in retrospect. The complete absence of normal forest sounds. The way our fire seemed to struggle, as if something was actively working against it. The certainty that we were being evaluated by an intelligence that had no interest in our survival. I still don't know what we encountered that night, but I know it was real, and I know it was watching us with a purpose I'd rather not understand. The mountains of Colorado are vast and wild, home to creatures that have learned to avoid human contact while remaining very much aware of our presence. Sometimes in the deep wilderness, the roles of hunter and hunted can shift without warning. And sometimes, the only thing that saves you is luck, fire, and the approaching dawn. The old Barquet ranch still stands, and Vincent tells me the current caretaker has reported his own experiences with unexplained lights and sounds. The cycle continues, and the watchers remain, patient and persistent in the darkness between the trees. Some places are meant to stay wild, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. My name is Ewan Thibodeau. Back in 1998, I was just another grease monkey in Falbrook, Oregon, population 2,317 and shrinking. This story isn't easy to tell, even all these years later. Sometimes I still wake up in cold sweat, hearing sounds that can't possibly be there. But I need to get it down, to make sense of what happened that autumn in the mountains. I'd been working at Harmon's auto shop since dropping out of community college. The pay wasn't much, but I had a knack for diagnosing engine problems just by listening to them, like a doctor with a stethoscope. My hands were always stained with oil, black crescents under my fingernails that never quite washed away. The local folks brought their vehicles to me when the newer shop in the next town over couldn't figure out what was wrong. My apartment sat above Maureen's bakery, which meant I woke every morning to the smell of fresh bread. The rent was reasonable, and I had everything I needed. A small TV, a comfortable couch, and walls decorated with fishing trophies. Simple pleasures for a simple life. Or so I thought. Lyle Dunnigan had been my best friend since 3rd grade when he punched Billy Alderson for making fun of my secondhand clothes. We'd been inseparable ever since. Now he worked at the lumber mill outside town, and we spent most weekends fishing at remote spots throughout the Cascade foothills. Lyle knew those woods like the back of his hand. His grandfather had been a forest ranger, and he'd passed all that knowledge down. It was mid-September when things started to feel off. I was working late at the shop, replacing the transmission on Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick. The radio played classic rock, mixing with the rhythmic clanking of my tools against metal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows in the garage. The door opened with a creak, letting in a gust of autumn air that smelled like pine and wet earth. Sheriff Vince Patterson stood in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. At 57, he'd been sheriff longer than anyone could remember, a fixture of Falbrook as permanent as the mountains themselves. "Evening, Ewan," he said, removing his hat. His silver hair caught the light. "Got a minute?" I wiped my hands on a shop rag, leaving behind dark streaks. "Sure thing, Sheriff. Something wrong with your cruiser?" He shook his head, eyes darting to the corners of the garage. "No, nothing like that. Just wanted to ask if you've noticed anything unusual lately. Anything at all." The seriousness in his voice made me pause. "Not really. Why do you ask?" He sighed, shoulders sagging beneath his uniform. "We've got people missing. 3 in the last month." That got my attention. In Falbrook, everyone knew everyone. 3 people missing was practically an epidemic. "Who?" I asked, setting down my wrench. "Couple of hikers from Portland went up near Sawmill Ridge 2 weeks back. Their cars still parked at the trailhead. And..." He paused, looking even more troubled. "Old Wilfred Simmons disappeared from his cabin 3 days ago." I knew Simmons. Reclusive old-timer who lived in a cabin about 7 miles into the woods. He came into town once a month for supplies and always brought his truck to me for maintenance. Cranky but sharp as a tack despite being well into his 70s. "You think he wandered off? Maybe got lost?" Sheriff Patterson snorted. "Simmons. Man's been living in those woods for 40 years. He doesn't get lost." He lowered his voice. "His cabin was torn apart, Ewan. Like something was looking for something. Or someone." A chill crept up my spine despite the garage's warmth. "Animal attack?" That's what I thought at first, but it doesn't add up. His rifle was still on the wall rack, unfired, and the damage... He shook his head. "Never seen anything like it. Claw marks 4 inches deep in solid oak beams." "Bears can do some damage," I offered. "Not like this, and not without leaving tracks." Ground around the cabin was dry as bone, not a single print. He put his hat back on. "I've got search parties organized, but I want you to be careful if you're heading into the woods. You and Lyle still planning that fishing trip?" I nodded. "Next weekend. Up to Blackwater Creek. His face darkened. That's not far from where the hikers went missing. Maybe consider another spot this time. We'll be fine, Sheriff. Been going there for years. He didn't look convinced. Just keep your eyes open, and maybe pack something besides fishing gear if you get my meaning. After he left, I tried to focus on the Buick, but my mind kept returning to our conversation. I'd grown up with stories about the dangers lurking in those mountains. Bears, cougars, the occasional wolf. But something in the sheriff's voice suggested this was different. That night, I met Lyle at O'Malley's bar. The place was dim, smelling of stale beer and cigarettes despite the smoking ban. A few locals hunched over their drinks, voices low. Something felt subdued about the place, a tension hanging in the air. Lyle was already nursing a beer, his broad shoulders hunched over the bar. At 6'3", with hands like baseball mitts, he looked more like a professional wrestler than a sawmill worker. His red beard was neatly trimmed, contrasting with his flannel shirt. "You're late," he grunted as I slid onto the stool beside him. "Had to finish Mrs. Patterson's Buick." I signaled the bartender. "Sheriff stopped by the shop today." Lyle raised an eyebrow. "About what?" I lowered my voice. "People going missing. Hikers and Old Man Simmons." "Heard about that." He took a long pull from his beer. "Mill's been buzzing with talk. Myers thinks it's some serial killer hiding out in the woods." "What do you think?" Lyle shrugged. "Could be anything. Simmons wasn't exactly stable. Maybe he finally lost it completely." Sheriff said his cabin was torn apart. Claw marks in the wood. Lyle's expression shifted subtly. "Bear, probably." That's what I said. He didn't think so. The bartender set a beer in front of me. I took a sip, the bitter taste doing little to wash away my unease. "We still on for Blackwater next weekend?" Lyle asked. I hesitated. Sheriff suggested we pick another spot. Lyle snorted. "Since when do we listen to Patterson? Remember when he tried to tell us Thunder Ridge was closed because of dangerous conditions? We went anyway and caught the biggest rainbow trout I've ever seen." "This feels different," I said. "It's just the same old bullshit. They always try to scare people away from the good spots." He finished his beer and set the glass down with finality. "We're going to Blackwater. Best fishing this time of year, and I need a break from the mill." I knew better than to argue when Lyle had made up his mind. Besides, he was probably right. People got lost in the woods all the time, especially city folks who underestimated the wilderness. And Simmons, well, who knew what had happened there? The old man had enemies, and his mind had been slipping lately. "Fine," I conceded, "but we're bringing my dad's old rifle." Lyle grinned. "Now you're talking." As we discussed details for the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us through the grimy bar windows. But when I turned to look, there was nothing but darkness beyond the glass. The reflection of hanging lights obscuring whatever might be out there. That night, I dreamed of deep woods and distorted howls echoing between ancient trees. I woke gasping for breath, sheets soaked with sweat, the memory of glowing eyes fading as consciousness returned. I told myself it was just my imagination, stirred up by the sheriff's warnings. I had no idea how terribly, fatally wrong I was. The week dragged on with an oppressive heaviness. More whispers circulated through town about the disappearances. Another hiker vanished, a college student named Wesley Mitchell who'd been camping alone near Timber Lake. His backpack was found hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground, contents scattered across the forest floor. No one could explain how it got there. I was replacing spark plugs in a Honda when Marla Simmons, Wilfred's niece, came into the shop. Her eyes were red-rimmed, hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Ewan, she said, voice cracking. Have you heard anything about Uncle Will? I set down my tools and wiped my hands. Nothing new. Sheriff's still looking. She nodded, blinking back tears. They found his boots yesterday. Just his boots, sitting neatly by the creek like he'd taken them off to wade. No footprints, nothing else. I didn't know what to say. Marla and I had dated briefly in high school before realizing we were better as friends. She worked as a nurse at the county clinic now. They'll find him, I offered lamely. No, they won't. Her certainty was chilling. Something's happening in those woods, Ewan. Something bad. The clinic's been getting strange cases. Hunters coming in with deep scratches they can't explain. Hikers with memory loss who can't account for missing hours. Could be anything, I said. Bears, mountain lions. It's not animals, she interrupted. The wound patterns are all wrong. And there's something else. She lowered her voice. The missing aren't all strangers. Before the hikers, before Uncle Will, there was Ben Kovach. Ben had been the town drunk, a fixture on the bench outside the liquor store. I hadn't seen him around lately, but hadn't thought much about it. Ben left town all the time on benders, I said. Not like this. They found his shopping cart by the river trail, bottles untouched. Ben never left alcohol behind. Her eyes met mine. Sheriff Patterson is keeping it quiet to avoid panic, but I heard them talking at the clinic. 6 people missing in total. 6 people. A chill settled in my stomach. You and Lyle still going fishing this weekend? She asked. Yeah, up to Blackwater. Her face paled. Don't. Please, Ewan. Uncle Will's cabin is only 3 miles from there. We'll be careful, I assured her. We're bringing protection. She shook her head in frustration. You men are all the same. Think a gun makes you invincible. She turned to leave, then paused. At least promise you'll stay alert and keep your radio on. I promise, I said. After she left, I tried calling Lyle to suggest changing our plans, but he didn't answer. Probably working the late shift at the mill. I left a message mentioning what Marla had told me, hoping he might reconsider. That evening, I stopped by the sheriff's office. Deputy Walsh sat at the front desk, looking exhausted. Sheriff around? I asked. Out with the search party, Walsh replied. Probably won't be back until late. Any news about the missing people? Walsh's expression darkened. Nothing good. Found some torn clothing belonging to one of the hikers, shredded to ribbons. He leaned forward. Between you and me, I've never seen damage like that. Not from any animal I know. What do you think it is? He shrugged. Sheriff's called in some wildlife experts from the State Department. They're setting up cameras around the search areas. As I turned to leave, Walsh called after me. Hey, Ewan, you carrying when you're in the woods these days? I nodded. Good. Make sure it's loaded. On Friday morning, Lyle finally called. Got your message, he said without preamble. Still going to Blackwater. Lyle, 6 people are missing now. Maybe we should... That's exactly why we need to go, he cut in. I've been talking to some of the guys at the mill. Something weird's going on in those woods, and it's not just hikers getting lost. What do you mean? There was a pause. Brett's cousin works for the Forest Service. Said they found animal carcasses all through the eastern range. Deer, elk, even a black bear. All torn apart but not eaten. Could be poachers, I suggested. Poachers don't leave the meat behind. And they don't do... His voice dropped. What was done to these animals? And that's supposed to convince me to go fishing? We're not just going fishing, Ewan. I want to see for ourselves what's happening up there. Brett's cousin marked locations on a map where they found the carcasses. There's a pattern. My chest tightened. What kind of pattern? They're all in a rough circle. And Blackwater Creek is right at the center. I should have said no. Should have told him he was crazy. but curiosity mixed with a strange sense of duty. If something was happening in our woods, didn't we have a responsibility to find out what? Fine, I said finally. But we're bringing every weapon we can carry. Already ahead of you. I'll pick you up at dawn tomorrow. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. I closed the shop early and went home to pack. I pulled my father's Remington 870 shotgun from the closet, along with a box of shells. The gun had been gathering dust since Dad passed 5 years earlier, but I'd kept it clean and functional. As I cleaned the barrel one last time, the local news played on the TV. The anchor was talking about the unprecedented number of disappearances in the Falbrook area. They showed photos of the missing. The 2 Portland hikers, college student Wesley Mitchell, Old Man Simmons, Ben Kovach, and someone I hadn't heard about, a forest ranger named Andrea Phillips. The report cut to Sheriff Patterson giving a statement, urging people to avoid remote areas until further notice. Behind his professional demeanor, I could see the strain in his eyes. He knew something he wasn't saying. I tried calling Marla to let her know where we'd be, but only got her voicemail. I left a detailed message with our planned route and promised to check in by radio. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts. Dreams of dark woods and watching eyes plagued me. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I was running through a moonlit forest, something massive crashing through the underbrush behind me. I could hear its rasping breath, feel its hunger like a physical weight pressing down. I woke with a strangled gasp at 4 a.m., sheets drenched in sweat. Dawn arrived with a blanket of fog so thick I could barely see the end of my street. A bad omen, I thought, but pushed the idea away. I wasn't superstitious. Not then, anyway. Lyle pulled up in his battered truck at 5:30 right on time. The bed was loaded with our usual fishing gear, plus additions that spoke to our unease. Extra flashlights, first aid kits, a larger tent than usual, and what looked like enough food for a week rather than a weekend. "Ready?" he asked as I loaded my shotgun into the truck. He had his grandfather's lever-action Marlin propped against the passenger seat. "As I'll ever be," I replied, climbing in. We drove in silence for the first few miles, the fog parting before our headlights only to close again behind us. The radio played softly, some morning show discussing the search for the missing hikers. "They're saying it might be a serial killer," Lyle said eventually. "Some psycho living in the woods." "You believe that?" He shrugged, eyes fixed on the road. "Easier to believe than the alternatives." "Which are?" "Something not human." His voice was flat, matter of fact. I glanced at him. Lyle had always been the pragmatic one, feet firmly planted in reality. This kind of talk wasn't like him. "Since when do you believe in monsters?" I asked. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "My grandfather used to tell stories, native legends about something in these mountains, called it the Windwalker, said it would come during certain years, when the stars aligned a certain way, take people. Your grandfather also believed the government was putting mind control drugs in the water supply," I reminded him. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair point." We turned onto the logging road that would take us most of the way to Blackwater Creek. The truck bounced over potholes and ruts, gravel pinging against the undercarriage. "Sheriff ever say what happened at Simmons' cabin?" Lyle asked. "Not details, just that it was torn apart. Marla mentioned they found his boots by the creek." Lyle frowned. "Just the boots?" I nodded. "That's not normal, Ewan. None of this is normal." The logging road ended at a small clearing. From here, we'd hike about 3 miles to our usual spot. We unloaded the truck in silence, shouldering our packs and gripping our fishing rods. Both of us kept our firearms readily accessible. The fog had thinned somewhat, but visibility in the forest was still poor. Moisture dripped from pine needles overhead, creating a constant patter like gentle rain. Our boots squelched in the damp earth as we followed the familiar trail. "Someone's been through here recently," Lyle said, pointing to fresh boot prints in the mud. "Big prints. Size 13 at least. Search party, maybe?" "Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. We hiked deeper into the woods, the mist swirling around ancient trees. For the first time in years, these familiar woods felt alien, unwelcoming. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. About halfway to our destination, Lyle suddenly stopped. "You smell that?" I sniffed the air. Beyond the usual forest scents of pine, earth, and decaying vegetation was something else. A sour, musty odor like rotting meat and wet fur. "What is that?" I whispered. Lyle slowly reached for his rifle. "I don't know, but it's not right." We stood perfectly still, listening. The forest had gone silent. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels, nothing but the soft drip of moisture from the trees. The silence itself felt wrong, heavy with anticipation. Then far off to our right came a sound that made my skin crawl. A low rumbling growl unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a cougar. Something else. "Move," Lyle hissed. Slowly. We continued down the trail, alert to every sound, every movement. The oppressive feeling of being watched intensified with each step. Twice more we heard that strange growl, closer each time. Near a bend in the trail, Lyle suddenly grabbed my arm. "Look," he whispered, pointing to a massive oak tree. Deep gouges ran along the trunk, 4 parallel lines that couldn't have been made by any normal forest animal. The cuts were fresh, sap still oozing from the wounded wood. "We should go back," I said, fear finally overriding curiosity. Lyle shook his head. "We're closer to the creek than the truck now. Besides," he hefted his rifle, "I want to know what we're dealing with." Against my better judgment, I followed him. We reached Blackwater Creek an hour later, emerging from the forest onto the rocky shore. The water ran high and fast with recent rains, dark and foreboding under the gray sky. Our usual camping spot lay in a small clearing about 50 yards upstream. As we approached, Lyle suddenly threw out an arm to stop me. "Something's not right," he whispered. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Our clearing had been used. Recently. The fire pit we'd built years ago contained fresh ashes. Surrounding it were odd arrangements of stones and sticks in patterns that made no sense. And hanging from a nearby tree branch was what appeared to be a mesh sack containing small bones. "What the hell?" I breathed. Lyle approached the site cautiously, rifle ready. "Someone's been staying here." "Homeless person, maybe?" I suggested, knowing it was unlikely this far into the wilderness. He shook his head, examining the strange arrangements. "This is ritualistic." A cold dread settled over me. "Lyle, we need to go." He nodded, finally seeming to accept the danger. "Yeah, let's..." A branch snapped in the forest behind us. We both whirled around, weapons raised. Nothing visible moved among the trees, but that terrible stench had returned, stronger than before. And with it came a sound that haunts my nightmares to this day. A wet, clicking noise, like bones being snapped and reset. "Run," Lyle whispered. "Now." We turned and sprinted along the creek bank, abandoning any pretense of courage. Whatever was in those woods, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal we knew. As we ran, the clicking sound followed, accompanied by heavy footfalls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "There!" Lyle pointed to a rocky outcrop ahead. "We can defend that position." We scrambled up the rocks, gaining about 15 feet of elevation. From here, we had a clear view of the surrounding area. We stood back to back, weapons ready, scanning the tree line. "See anything?" I panted. No, but it's out there, watching. The minutes stretched into an hour. The strange sounds had stopped, but that horrible stench lingered. Eventually, we made a decision. We make for the truck, Lyle said. Stay in the open as much as possible. I nodded, throat too dry to speak. We descended the rocks carefully and began moving upstream, staying close to the water and away from the tree line. The fog had lifted somewhat, but the forest remained a wall of shadows to our right. We'd covered perhaps half a mile when Lyle suddenly stopped. Look, he said, pointing across the creek. On the opposite bank, partially hidden by ferns, was a backpack. The same type carried by the missing college student, Wesley Mitchell. We should check it out, Lyle said. Are you insane? We need to get back to the truck and tell the sheriff. He hesitated, then nodded. You're right. Let's... His words were cut off by a horrific sound from the forest. Not a growl this time, but a high, keening wail that sounded disturbingly human, yet impossibly wasn't. It raised the hair on my arms and sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. Run! I shouted. We bolted, no longer caring about stealth or dignity. Pure animal fear drove us forward, the wailing growing louder behind us. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Something was moving through the trees, something tall and impossibly fast. I caught only glimpses. A flash of matted fur, the glint of eyes, the suggestion of limbs that seemed too long and jointed wrong. Don't look back! Lyle shouted. Just run! We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. Somehow we found the trail back to the truck and followed it blindly, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. The thing behind us never quite caught up, but never fell far behind either, as if it was toying with us. When the truck finally came into view, it felt like a miracle. We threw ourselves inside, Lyle fumbling with the keys as I slammed and locked my door. The engine roared to life, and we fishtailed out of the clearing, spewing gravel and mud. As we sped away, I finally allowed myself to look back. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. In the split second before it retreated into the shadows, I saw enough to know that our world had changed forever. What I saw couldn't exist, but it did. Neither of us spoke until we were back on the main highway, putting miles between ourselves and whatever lurked in those woods. We need to tell the sheriff, I finally said, voice shaking. Lyle nodded, face ashen. Yeah, but Ewan... What? Will he believe us? I had no answer for that. I wasn't sure I believed what I'd seen myself. We went straight to Sheriff Patterson's house rather than the station. This wasn't something to discuss in front of deputies and dispatch operators. The sheriff answered his door in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, coffee mug in hand. His expression shifted from annoyed to concerned as he took in our disheveled, terrified state. Inside, he said, stepping back. Now. We sat at his kitchen table while his wife, Rose, made fresh coffee. Neither of us touched our mugs when she set them down. The sheriff dismissed her with a gentle touch on the arm, and she retreated upstairs, casting worried glances over her shoulder. Start from the beginning, he said once we were alone. We took turns explaining what had happened, from the strange markings on the trees to the ritualistic site at our camping spot, to the thing that had chased us. I could tell from the sheriff's expression that he believed us, which was somehow more terrifying than if he'd dismissed our story. When we finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he reached for the phone. Who are you calling? Lyle asked. State Police, Forest Service, maybe the FBI. You believe us? I couldn't keep the surprise from my voice. Sheriff Patterson's eyes met mine. Son, I've lived in these mountains all my life. There are things in the deep woods that don't have names, things the native folks knew to leave alone. I thought they were just stories until Simmons disappeared. He dialed a number, spoke briefly to someone named Barnes, then hung up. State police will be here in 2 hours. Forest Service is already mobilizing teams to search the area around Blackwater Creek. Search teams won't be enough, Lyle said quietly. Whatever that thing is, it's dangerous, smart, and fast. The sheriff nodded grimly. I know. That's why I'm organizing a hunting party. Experienced locals who know the terrain and can handle themselves in a fight. Count us in, I said immediately, surprising myself. After what we'd seen, the logical response would be to get as far from Falbrook as possible. But something in me couldn't just run away. Not with people still missing, not with that thing still out there. Lyle nodded his agreement. We know where it was. We can lead you back. Sheriff Patterson studied us for a moment, then nodded. Get some rest. We move out at first light tomorrow. And boys, his voice grew solemn. Tell no one else what you saw. Last thing we need is panic spreading through town. We agreed and left, heading to Lyle's place since it was closer. Neither of us wanted to be alone. We showered, ate mechanically, and tried to process what had happened. Words felt inadequate for the terror we'd experienced. What do you think it was? I finally asked as we sat on his porch, beers in hand. Lyle shook his head. Nothing natural. Nothing that should exist. Your grandfather's windwalker? He shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe there are things in this world we're not meant to understand. I called Marla to let her know we were back safely, but kept the details vague. We got spooked and came back early, I told her. Sheriff's organizing another search party tomorrow. Be careful, she said, voice tight with worry. There's something wrong out there, Ewan. The clinic admitted 2 more hunters today with strange injuries. Deep puncture wounds that the doctor says look like, well, like oversized teeth marks. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, interrupted by nightmares. In the worst one, I was back in the forest, but alone this time. I could hear Lyle screaming somewhere in the darkness, begging for help. I ran toward his voice, only to find myself in a clearing illuminated by moonlight. In the center stood not Lyle, but the creature, taller than any man, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles and a face that was almost but not quite animal. It smiled at me with too many teeth and spoke with Lyle's voice. You're next. I woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat. Dawn was just breaking, pale light filtering through the blinds. Time to face the woods again. 19 men gathered at the sheriff's office by 6 a.m. Most were locals I knew, mill workers, farmers, a few hunters known for their tracking skills. They carried an arsenal of rifles, shotguns, and handguns. A few had brought more unusual weapons. One old-timer had a crossbow, another clutched what looked like a homemade flamethrower constructed from a propane tank. Sheriff Patterson arrived last, accompanied by 2 state police officers and a wildlife expert from the Forest Service. He outlined the plan. We would form 4 teams and approach the Blackwater Creek area from different directions, maintaining radio contact at all times. If anyone spotted anything unusual, they were to signal the others and hold position until backup arrived. We're dealing with something dangerous, the sheriff concluded. Possibly a rabid bear or wolf pack. Possibly, he hesitated, something else. Shoot first, ask questions later. But for God's sake, make sure you're not shooting at another team member. Lyle and I were assigned to the sheriff's team, along with Deputy Walsh and a local hunter named Donovan Reed, who claimed to have seen strange things in these woods for years. We would approach from the west, following the same trail Lyle and I had taken the day before. The drive to the trailhead was tense and quiet. Equipment rattled in the back of the sheriff's SUV as we bounced along the logging road. When we reached the clearing where Lyle had parked yesterday, we found 3 other vehicles already there, search parties that had started at dawn, looking for the missing hikers. Any sign of the search teams? Sheriff Patterson asked a Forest Service ranger who was coordinating from a temporary command post. The ranger shook his head. They radioed in about an hour ago from the North Ridge. Nothing so far. We set out on the trail, moving slowly and deliberately. Sheriff Patterson and Deputy Walsh led, followed by Lyle and me, with Reed bringing up the rear. Every sense was heightened, alert to the smallest sound or movement. The forest seemed normal today. Birds called, squirrels chattered overhead. But we all felt the underlying wrongness, a subtle disturbance in the natural rhythm. We reached the point where Lyle and I had first smelled that terrible odor. Today the air was clean, carrying only the usual forest scents. The markings were here, Lyle said, pointing to the massive oak. The sheriff examined the deep gouges in the bark. These weren't made by any bear I've ever seen. Reed ran his fingers over the marks. Too high up for a bear anyway. Whatever made these was tall, 7, 8 feet at least. We continued toward Blackwater Creek, moving even more cautiously now. I felt exposed, vulnerable, certain that eyes were watching from the shadows between trees. My shotgun felt inadequate against the memory of what I'd glimpsed the day before. When we neared the camping area, Sheriff Patterson signaled for us to stop and spread out. We advanced in a loose semicircle, weapons ready. The site appeared exactly as Lyle and I had left it, fire pit with old ashes, strange arrangements of stones and sticks, the mesh sack of bones still hanging from the tree branch. The sheriff examined everything carefully, taking photographs with a small camera. "This isn't random," he muttered. "These patterns mean something." Reed nodded in agreement. "Old symbols, protective wards maybe." At our questioning looks, he added, "My grandmother was half Klamath. She knew these things." Walsh checked his radio. "Other teams are in position. No sightings reported." The sheriff made a decision. "We'll follow the creek upstream. That's where you boys saw the backpack, right?" We nodded and led the way, staying close to the water as we had yesterday. The creek burbled peacefully, sunlight dancing on its surface. It seemed impossible that anything sinister could exist in such a tranquil setting. We found the backpack exactly where we'd seen it, partially hidden by ferns on the opposite bank. Deputy Walsh crossed the creek at a shallow point and retrieved it. "Mitchell's," he confirmed, checking the ID in a side pocket. "Looks like it's been here a while. Weather damage." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Keep looking. There might be other signs." We spread out, searching the area methodically. I was examining a fallen log when Lyle called out from further upstream. "Got something?" We converged on his position. He stood at the edge of a small clearing, pointing to the ground. A hiking boot lay on its side, caked with dried mud. Not far away was its mate, placed neatly upright against a rock. "Simmons?" I asked. The sheriff nodded. "Matches the description." But it was what lay beyond the boots that made my blood run cold. The clearing floor was covered with a complex pattern of intertwined circles drawn in what looked like ash. At the center stood a crude wooden structure, a tripod of branches about 6 feet tall, from which hung various objects. Bits of cloth, small bones, feathers, and something that looked horribly like human teeth. "What the hell?" Walsh whispered. Reed approached the structure cautiously. "This is old magic. Very old. Whoever, or whatever, made this is trying to open something." "Open what?" Lyle asked. Reed's expression was grim. "A doorway." The sheriff was about to respond when his radio crackled. A voice broke through, distorted by static. "Team 3 to Sheriff, we've found..." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched squeal. "Team 3, report," the sheriff said urgently. "Team 3, do you copy?" Nothing but static. "That's Morgan's team," Walsh said. "They were checking the eastern ridge." Sheriff Patterson tried again. Any team, do you copy? This is Sheriff Patterson. We have lost contact with Team 3. After a moment, another voice responded through heavy static. Team 4 here. We hear you. No contact with Team 3. Our radio's acting up too. Lot of interference suddenly. The sheriff looked troubled. Team 4, proceed to Team 3's last known position. Approach with caution and report what you find. Copy that, came the crackled reply. Reed was staring into the forest beyond the clearing, body tense. We should leave. Now. What's wrong? I asked. We're being watched. I felt it too. That same crawling sensation I'd experienced yesterday, like invisible eyes assessing us from every direction. The birds had gone silent again. The forest held its breath. Then we heard it, that same wet, clicking sound that had pursued us before, coming from somewhere to our left. Move back toward the creek, Sheriff Patterson ordered quietly. Stay together. We began retreating slowly, weapons trained on the surrounding forest. The clicking grew louder, joined by a low growl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. 20 yards from the bizarre structure, Reed suddenly froze. There, he whispered, pointing. At first, I saw nothing. Then a shadow within shadows moved, a suggestion of form that made no logical sense. It wasn't hiding behind a tree. It was somehow part of the tree, or the tree was part of it. The boundaries between creature and forest blurred in a way that hurt my eyes to focus on. What is that? Walsh hissed. Before anyone could answer, the radio erupted with frantic voices. It's here. God, it's... Shoot it. Shoot. Can't get it clear. Fall back. Fall. Then only static. Team 4, Sheriff Patterson shouted into the radio. Report. Nothing. The clicking sound intensified, surrounding us now. The shadows between trees seemed to deepen, swirl, take form. That terrible stench returned, choking and thick. Run! Reed suddenly shouted. Back to the trail! Now! We ran, abandoning any pretense of controlled retreat. Something crashed through the underbrush behind us, something large and fast. I heard Lyle firing his rifle, the shots echoing through the trees. Sheriff Patterson and Walsh joined in, firing blindly into the pursuing shadows. I ran until my lungs burned, jumping over fallen logs and crashing through thickets. Branches whipped at my face, drawing blood. Behind me, I heard a scream. Deputy Walsh's voice cut off mid-cry. Keep going, the sheriff shouted. Don't stop. We reached the main trail and sprinted toward the trailhead. Reed was in front, followed by me, then Lyle, with the sheriff bringing up the rear. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant, but we didn't slow down. The clearing with our vehicles came into sight. The Forest Service ranger stood by the command post, looking alarmed at our panicked arrival. Where are the others? He demanded. Walsh is down, Sheriff Patterson gasped. Teams 3 and 4 not responding. The ranger grabbed his radio. All search teams, emergency evacuation. Return to base immediately. Repeat, emergency evacuation. We collapsed against the vehicles, gasping for breath. Only then did I realize Reed was clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. What happened? I asked. He pulled his hand away to reveal 3 deep gashes running from shoulder to elbow. It got close. Very close. Sheriff Patterson examined the wounds. Those aren't claw marks, he said quietly. They look like cuts, deliberate ones. Reed nodded grimly. It's intelligent, hunting us. The ranger brought a first aid kit and began cleaning Reed's wounds. What was it? Bear? Mountain lion? Lyle laughed bitterly. If only. Over the next hour, other search teams trickled back, all reporting strange sounds and sensations of being watched. Team 2 had found another ritualistic site similar to the one we'd discovered. But teams 3 and 4 never returned. 12 men, vanished as completely as the hikers they'd been searching for. Sheriff Patterson organized a larger, better-armed group to go back for Walsh and the missing teams. Lyle and I volunteered again, unable to abandon our people despite the terror clawing at our insides. By mid-afternoon, 30 armed men ventured back into the forest. This time we moved as a single unit, a wall of weapons facing outward in all directions. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, the only sounds our own footsteps and breathing. We found Walsh's body first, or what remained of it. I won't describe what we saw. Some images are better left unshared. Sheriff Patterson's face went ashen, but he ordered us to continue. We had to find the other teams. We searched until dusk, finding nothing but empty forest and an occasional blood trail that ended abruptly. As darkness approached, the sheriff made the hard decision to retreat. We couldn't risk being in these woods after nightfall. Back at the command post, state police had arrived in force, along with FBI agents and more Forest Service personnel. The area was declared a crime scene, with roadblocks established on all access roads. The official story released to the press spoke of a possible serial killer operating in the woods, or perhaps a pack of rabid wolves. Those of us who had seen the truth knew better. This was something outside human experience, something ancient and malevolent that had awakened in our forests. Sheriff Patterson gathered those who had directly encountered the entity: Lyle, Reed, myself, and a few others who had glimpsed it from Team 2. "Whatever this is," he said, voice heavy with fatigue and grief, "it's beyond conventional law enforcement. I've spoken to some people who might be able to help. Specialists in unusual phenomena. They're flying in tonight." "What do we do until then?" Lyle asked. "We prepare," Reed answered before the sheriff could speak. "It's established a hunting territory. It won't stay in the deep woods forever." A chill ran through me at the implication. "You think it will come to town?" Reed's eyes met mine. "I think nowhere is safe anymore." The specialists arrived just before midnight. 3 serious-looking men and a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Eleanor Weiss, an anthropologist specializing in folklore and unexplained phenomena. They set up operations in a back room of the sheriff's office, pinning maps to the walls and unpacking equipment I didn't recognize. Dr. Weiss interviewed each of us who had encountered the creature, recording our descriptions and asking detailed questions about its behavior. When we had finished, she conferred with her colleagues in low voices. "What are we dealing with?" Sheriff Patterson finally asked. Dr. Weiss chose her words carefully. "The entity you've encountered has characteristics consistent with certain predatory cryptids documented across cultural boundaries. The ritualistic elements suggest it possesses some form of intelligence and purpose beyond mere hunting." "In English, please," Lyle said. One of her colleagues, a gray-haired man named Blackburn, spoke bluntly. "It's a predator that's existed in these mountains for centuries, possibly millennia. Native tribes had various names for it. European settlers occasionally encountered it and incorporated it into their own folklore. It hibernates for long periods, awakening when certain conditions are met." "What conditions?" I asked. "That's what we're trying to determine," Dr. Weiss said. "Often these creatures are triggered by environmental changes, human activity in previously undisturbed areas, or certain celestial alignments." Reed, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "The lumber company started clear-cutting a new section of the eastern ridge last month. Ancient forest, never been touched before." Dr. Weiss nodded. "That could very well be the trigger." "How do we kill it?" Sheriff Patterson asked. The specialists exchanged glances. "Conventional weapons may injure it," Blackburn said carefully, "but probably won't be sufficient to destroy it. These entities typically have specific vulnerabilities that vary by individual creature." "So we're screwed," Lyle muttered. "Not necessarily. Dr. Weiss said. The ritualistic sites you discovered may provide clues. The entity is creating these for a reason, possibly to strengthen itself, possibly as part of a larger purpose. If we can disrupt these sites and understand their meaning, we might find its weakness. Plans were made for the following day. 2 teams would venture back into the forest, one to examine and possibly dismantle the ritualistic sites, another to try tracking the creature to its lair. Both would be heavily armed with conventional weapons, plus some specialized equipment the team had brought. I volunteered for the tracking team, along with Lyle, Reed, and several experienced hunters from town. Sheriff Patterson would lead the other team with Dr. Weiss and her colleagues. We would maintain constant radio contact, with a large backup force standing by at the trailhead. That night, no one slept well. I stayed at Lyle's again, both of us keeping our weapons close. We talked little, each lost in our own thoughts. Around 3 a.m., we heard howling from the distant mountains. Not wolves, not coyotes, but that same unnaturally deep, guttural cry we'd heard in the woods. It was closer to town than before. It's moving, Lyle said quietly. Morning came with heavy fog and a light drizzle. Perfect conditions for something to hide. We gathered at the sheriff's office, checking weapons and equipment. The mood was grim, determined. These were no longer search parties looking for missing hikers. This was a war party hunting a killer. Dr. Weiss approached me before we left. Your descriptions of the entity were the most detailed, she said. You seem to be particularly attuned to it somehow. Lucky me, I said bitterly. She handed me a small object, a stone pendant on a leather cord. Ancient symbols were carved into its surface, similar to those we'd seen in the ritualistic sites. Wear this, she said. It may provide some protection, or at least make you less visible to it. You believe in this stuff? I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. Her expression remained serious. After 20 years studying these phenomena, I've learned to use every possible advantage. Whether it works through psychological suggestion or genuine metaphysical properties, doesn't matter if it keeps you alive. I put the pendant around my neck, feeling slightly foolish but unwilling to reject any potential help. Our team set out just after 8 a.m. The forest felt different today, heavier, more oppressive. The fog limited visibility to about 30 yards, transforming familiar trees into looming shadows. Sounds were muffled, disorienting. We split up at the main trail junction, Sheriff Patterson's team heading toward Blackwater Creek, while we veered northeast, following tracks discovered by the state police yesterday. Reed led our group, moving with surprising stealth despite his injured arm. The rest of us followed in single file, alert to every sound and movement. The tracks led us toward an area locally known as Deadfall Basin, a remote valley where an old landslide had created a jumble of massive boulders and fallen trees. Few people ventured there. The terrain was treacherous, with sudden drop-offs and unstable ground. Perfect place for something to hide, Reed murmured as we approached the basin's edge. We descended carefully into the fog-shrouded valley. Visibility dropped to mere feet in places, the mist swirling around shattered tree trunks and moss-covered rocks. Water dripped constantly from above, creating an eerie percussion. About halfway into the basin, Reed halted suddenly, raising a hand for silence. We froze, straining to hear what had alerted him. Nothing but the dripping water and our own breathing. Then I smelled it, that distinctive putrid odor. It was everywhere around us, embedded in the mist itself. We're in its territory, Reed whispered. Lyle gestured ahead, where the fog seemed to thin slightly. There's a clearing up there. We advanced with agonizing slowness, testing each step before committing our weight. The clearing gradually emerged from the mist, a roughly circular space about 50 yards across, surrounded by towering pines and massive boulders. What we found there haunts me still. The clearing had been transformed into a massive version of the ritualistic sites we'd seen previously. Concentric circles of stones radiated outward from a central point where a structure stood, not a simple tripod this time, but an elaborate framework of branches and bones that rose nearly 20 feet high. Hanging from this macabre construction were personal effects from the missing: backpacks, clothing, equipment, and other things, human things. I won't describe them. The ground beneath the structure was stained dark, the earth churned and wet. Several smaller arrangements surrounded it, stones placed in specific patterns, sticks forming complex symbols. "My God," one of the hunters whispered. Reed approached the central structure cautiously. "This is its nest, its altar." He examined the symbols etched into the bones. "It's building something, growing stronger." Lyle keyed his radio. "Sheriff, we found something. Deadfall Basin. You need to see this." Static answered him. He tried again with the same result. "Radios won't work here," Reed said. "Not this close to its power center." I felt something then. A pressure in my head, a presence pushing against my consciousness. The pendant around my neck grew warm against my skin. "It knows we're here," I said. The others looked at me sharply. "How do you know?" Lyle asked. I couldn't explain it, just a certainty that filled me. "It's coming, fast." Reed's face hardened. "Destroy it. Destroy the structure. Now." We didn't question him. Moving with desperate energy, we attacked the grotesque altar, pulling down branches, scattering bones, disrupting the careful arrangements of stones and symbols. The response was immediate and terrifying. The temperature plummeted. The fog thickened, swirling violently around us. That wet, clicking sound erupted from all directions at once, punctuated by howls of rage that seemed to shake the earth itself. "Form a circle," Reed shouted. "Backs together." We complied. 8 men standing shoulder to shoulder, weapons pointed outward into the churning mist. The clicking intensified, moving rapidly around us, drawing closer with each circuit. "I see it!" someone shouted. I followed his aim and caught a glimpse of something moving through the fog, taller than a man, with a silhouette that seemed to shift and change even as I watched. It vanished before anyone could fire. "There!" Another call from the opposite direction. Again, just a glimpse, a suggestion of limbs, an impression of eyes reflecting light that shouldn't have been there in the fog-shrouded clearing. "It's toying with us," Reed said, "hunting us." One of the hunters, a man named Garrison, broke formation suddenly, firing wildly into the mist. "Come on, you bastard!" he screamed. "Get back in formation!" Lyle shouted. Too late. Something massive and dark surged from the fog, enveloping Garrison. His scream cut off with a wet, crunching sound. The shape retreated as quickly as it had appeared, dragging Garrison with it. "Stay together," Reed ordered, as the rest of us instinctively moved to pursue. "That's what it wants." We tightened our circle, pressed together, weapons ready. I felt the pendant growing hotter against my skin, almost burning now. Something was building in the air around us, an electrical tension, a distortion of reality itself. "What's happening?" Lyle asked, voice tight with fear. Reed's expression was grim. "The door is opening." The fog began to rotate around us, forming a perfect circle with our group at the center. Through the swirling mist, impossible shapes moved. Things I can't describe because my mind couldn't properly process what my eyes were seeing. Dimensions folded in ways they shouldn't. Spaces existed where no space should be. And in the center of it all, taking form from the mist itself, was the creature. It stood at least 9 feet tall, its body a nightmare amalgamation of features that seemed to shift and flow. One moment it appeared almost bear-like, the next more canine, then almost human, yet always wrong in fundamental ways. Its limbs bent at impossible angles. Its face, if you could call it that, contained too many eyes, too many mouths. Its skin rippled with patterns that hurt to look at directly. We fired. Every man emptied his weapon into the monstrosity. It recoiled, howling in pain and rage, black ichor spraying from wounds that closed almost as quickly as they formed. The pendant against my chest suddenly shattered, the fragments burning like hot coals. In that moment I understood, not through thought but through some deeper insight that bypassed my conscious mind. "The symbols!" I shouted. "Reverse the symbols!" Reed understood immediately. While the others continued firing, keeping the creature at bay, Reed and I scrambled to rearrange the stones and sticks we had scattered. We placed them in reverse patterns, guided by some instinct I couldn't explain. The effect was immediate. The swirling fog faltered. The creature's form became less stable, parts of it seeming to flicker in and out of existence. It roared in fury and lunged toward us with renewed desperation. Lyle emptied his final rounds into its face, driving it back momentarily. "Whatever you're doing, do it faster." Reed and I completed the reversed pattern just as the creature gathered itself for another attack. The pendant fragments, still burning against my skin, suddenly disintegrated completely. The world seemed to hold its breath for one eternal moment. Then reality tore. A rift opened in the air itself. Not darkness, but an absence more fundamental, a void that shouldn't exist in our universe. The creature howled as it was drawn toward the opening, its form stretching and distorting even further. It fought against the pull, digging clawed appendages into the earth, reaching for us with limbs that extended impossibly. One of the hunters was caught by a flailing tentacle and dragged screaming toward the rift. Lyle grabbed the man's arm, and I grabbed Lyle's, forming a human chain. For a moment we were locked in a tug-of-war with the creature, the hunter suspended between worlds. Then the hunter's arm simply came apart in Lyle's grip. He vanished into the void along with the creature. The rift collapsed with a sound like thunder, leaving behind nothing but a scorched circle in the clearing and the echoing silence of the forest. We stood frozen, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The fog was thinning rapidly now, sunlight beginning to penetrate between the trees. "Is it gone?" someone finally asked. Reed examined the ground where the rift had opened. "Not gone. Banished. For now." "What the hell was that thing?" Lyle demanded. Reed shook his head. "Something that doesn't belong in our world. Something that found a way in and has been trying to establish itself here." "And the symbols? The rituals?" I asked. "Its way of reshaping our reality to make it more hospitable. Creating a bridge between worlds." We gathered what remained of our courage and equipment and made our way out of Deadfall Basin. As we climbed back to the main trail, our radios suddenly crackled back to life. "Anyone copy? This is Sheriff Patterson. We've found something at the creek site. Some kind of doorway." Reed grabbed his radio. "Sheriff, do not approach any structures. We encountered the entity. It's using these sites to create passages between worlds." Static then. "Reed? Thank God. What happened?" "We'll explain when we meet up. But for now, destroy any symbolic arrangements you find. Completely dismantle them." "Understood. Return to the command post immediately." When we reached the trailhead, we found chaos. While we'd been in Deadfall Basin, the creature, or perhaps others like it, had attacked a search team on the eastern ridge. 5 men dead, 7 wounded. One of Dr. Weiss's colleagues was among the casualties. Sheriff Patterson looked haunted when we briefed him on what had happened. Dr. Weiss listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on the symbols we'd seen, and the effects of reversing them. "You've confirmed much of what we suspected," she said when we finished. "These entities exist in a space between dimensions. They create these ritual sites as anchor points to strengthen their presence in our reality." "So is it gone?" Sheriff Patterson asked. Reed and Dr. Weiss exchanged glances. "Not permanently," she said. "You've closed the door for now, but it will try to find another way through." "What did we do?" I asked. "Find and destroy every ritual site in these woods," Dr. Weiss said. "Then seal the area. No human activity for at least a year. No logging, no hiking, nothing. Let the natural barriers between worlds strengthen again." The next 3 days were a blur of carefully coordinated expeditions into the forest. Teams of heavily armed men, each accompanied by one of Dr. Weiss's remaining colleagues, systematically located and dismantled every ritual site they could find. 17 in total scattered throughout the mountains in a pattern that, when mapped, formed a massive symbol visible only from above. There were more encounters, glimpses of shapes moving through trees, strange sounds in the darkness, the occasional howl from distant ridges. But nothing like what we'd faced in Deadfall Basin. The entity was weakened, retreating. On the 4th day, as we prepared to dismantle the final known site, a massive storm rolled in. Not a natural storm. The clouds moved wrong, twisting and churning with purposeful malevolence. Lightning struck repeatedly around the ritual site, as if trying to protect it. Sheriff Patterson made the call to proceed despite the danger. As the team approached the site, a complex arrangement of stones and bones on a high ridge, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the trees with a voice that sounded almost human. Lightning struck closer, igniting several trees. Through driving rain and howling wind, the team reached the site and began dismantling it. As the last stones were scattered, a final bolt of lightning struck the center of the circle, but instead of destroying it, the lightning seemed to be absorbed, channeled downward into the earth itself. The ground shuddered. A fissure opened, widening rapidly as the team scrambled to escape. Trees toppled into the growing chasm. Within minutes, what had been a small clearing was a gaping wound in the mountain, 30 feet across, and of unknowable depth. As suddenly as it had begun, the storm dissipated. The fissure stopped expanding, though occasional rumbles suggested instability deep below. Forest Service geologists were called in to examine the phenomenon. Their instruments detected nothing unusual, just a sinkhole, they said, probably caused by underground streams weakening the limestone substrate. Those of us who knew better said nothing. Sometimes explanations are more comfortable than truth. In the aftermath, official reports cited a combination of bear attacks, geographic disorientation, and possible exposure to environmental toxins to explain the deaths and disappearances. The missing were eventually declared dead, their bodies presumably lost in the vast wilderness or destroyed by wildlife. Sheriff Patterson enforced Dr. Weiss's recommendation. With the support of state authorities, the eastern portion of the national forest was declared off-limits due to geological instability and environmental concerns. Logging operations were suspended indefinitely. Dr. Weiss and her remaining colleague left after a week, providing contact information should anything else occur. They took with them detailed documentation of everything we had seen and done. Life in Falbrook attempted to return to normal. People spoke in hushed tones about the tragedy, creating narratives they could live with. The truth was too monstrous, too impossible to incorporate into daily life. But those of us who had encountered the entity firsthand knew better. We carried the knowledge like a physical weight. Some, like Reed, left town entirely. Others turned to alcohol or prescription medications to dull the memories. I stayed for a while, trying to rebuild my life. But the nightmares continued. And sometimes, on particularly still nights, I would hear distant howls from the mountains. Howls that couldn't possibly be wolves or coyotes. 2 months after the events at Deadfall Basin, I made my decision. I sold my tools, packed my few possessions, and left Falbrook behind. I drove east, putting as much distance as possible between myself and those mountains. It's been 27 years since I left Falbrook. I settled in Michigan, about as far from the Pacific Northwest as I could get while staying in the continental United States. I found work as a mechanic here too. Some skills transfer anywhere, and eventually opened my own shop. I married, had a daughter, divorced. Life moved on, but the memories remained. For years I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see something emerging from shadows. I avoided forests entirely for a decade. The nightmares came less frequently, but never disappeared completely. I've told no one the full truth until now. Not my ex-wife, not my therapist, not the handful of friends I've made here. Who would believe it? Who would want to believe it? I stayed in sporadic contact with Lyle for a few years. He remained in Falbrook longer than I did, eventually taking over management of the sawmill when operations resumed, in carefully selected areas well away from the eastern mountains. He married Marla, which surprised me, but made a certain kind of sense. Shared trauma creates powerful bonds. Our conversations grew less frequent as years passed. The last time we spoke was 2011. He called late one night, voice tight with tension. "It's happening again," he said without preamble. My blood froze. "What do you mean?" "Hikers missing on the North Ridge. 3 in the last month. Sheriff found arrangements of stones and sticks." Sheriff Patterson had retired years earlier, replaced by a younger man who hadn't experienced the events of 1998. "Have you told them what it means?" I asked. "Tried to. They think I'm crazy. PTSD, they said." His laugh was bitter. "I called that Dr. Weiss. Numbers disconnected. Her colleague, too." "What are you going to do?" A long pause. "What we have to." "Lyle, don't. Call in the state authorities, FBI, someone." "With what evidence?" "They sealed those records, Ewan. You know that. Official report says animal attacks and geological events." Another pause. "I just wanted you to know. In case..." "In case what?" "In case I don't call again." I tried to talk him out of whatever he was planning, offered to come back to help. He refused, said he had a group of locals who remembered, who would help him. That was the last time we spoke. I called repeatedly over the next few weeks, but he never answered. Eventually, his number was disconnected. I searched online news archives for any information. A small article in the regional paper mentioned, "Tragic accident claims lives of local mill manager and 4 others in forest fire." Names listed included Lyle Dunnigan and Marla Simmons Dunnigan. I knew it wasn't a forest fire. At least not an accidental one. For years after, I monitored news from the Falbrook area obsessively. Reports of missing hikers dropped to 0. Whatever Lyle and his group had done, it seemed to have worked, at least temporarily, until last month. I still have automated news alerts set for certain keywords associated with Falbrook. On March 15, 2025, multiple alerts triggered simultaneously. Unprecedented seismic activity. Unexplained disappearances. Wildlife behaving abnormally. According to the reports, a minor earthquake had opened a fissure in the eastern mountains, precisely where our final team had dismantled the last ritual site. Forest Service personnel investigating the disturbance failed to return. A search party found their vehicles abandoned, equipment scattered. The article included a quote from the current sheriff. "We're dealing with a dangerous situation that may be connected to similar incidents in 1998 and 2011. We've requested federal assistance and are evacuating communities within a 10-mile radius of the affected area." They remembered, or at least some did. But would they know what to do? Would they understand what they were facing? I packed a bag that night, loaded my grandfather's old revolver, not that it would do much good against what awaited in those mountains, but it was better than nothing. I wrote a letter to my daughter explaining where I was going and why, to be delivered if I didn't return. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Thibodeau? A woman's voice, unfamiliar. Yes? Who is this? My name is Sophia Weiss. You knew my mother, Eleanor. My heart skipped. Dr. Weiss? How did you find me? Mother kept detailed records. Your name features prominently in her Falbrook file. A pause. She passed away 3 years ago, but she left protocols in place for certain scenarios. Falbrook is one of them. It's happening again, isn't it? Yes. A team is assembling. People who have encountered these entities before, people with relevant expertise. We need your first-hand experience. I closed my eyes, memories flooding back. The creature's shifting form, the wrongness of its existence, the deaths of people I knew. When and where? I asked. Portland International Airport, tomorrow, 3 p.m. A private plane will take us to a facility near Falbrook. She hesitated. I should warn you, this incursion appears more significant than previous ones. The entity is stronger now, more established. How do you know? We've been monitoring certain indicators, unusual weather patterns, wildlife migrations, electromagnetic anomalies, all point to a major breach in the dimensional barriers. I thought of Lyle, of the sacrifice he and others had made in 2011. Would I be asked to make the same choice? I'll be there, I said finally. Thank you, Mr. Thibodeau. One more thing. Yes? Have you been experiencing dreams? Particularly vivid ones involving the entity or the forests around Falbrook? My throat tightened. The nightmares had returned in recent weeks, more intense than ever. How did you know? It's how they find anchors in our world, through minds that have encountered them before. You've been marked, Mr. Thibodeau. We all have. After we hung up, I stood at my window for a long time, staring at the night sky. Somewhere across the country, in mountains I had fled decades ago, something ancient and terrible was awakening again. Something that had touched my life, marked me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Tomorrow I would return to Falbrook, to the forests that haunted my nightmares. I would face again what shouldn't exist in our world but did. I didn't know if I would survive this time, but I knew I had to try. For Lyle, for Walsh, for all those who had been taken by the entity, and for those who would be if we failed. The pendant Dr. Weiss had given me all those years ago had disintegrated during our confrontation with the creature. But sometimes, in the darkness just before dawn, I can still feel its warmth against my skin. A reminder that boundaries exist between worlds, and that some can be strengthened while others can be broken. I don't know what awaits me in Falbrook, but I know this. Some horrors cannot be escaped, only confronted. Some doors, once opened, must be sealed by those who first glimpsed what lay beyond. My name is Ewan Thibodeau, and I am returning to the woods beyond Falbrook, to finish what began in 1998, to close the door once and for all.